Hey everyone, tonight we're embarking on one of history's most extraordinary journeys of transformation, the story of a young dreamer who fell from privilege into slavery, from slavery into prison, and from prison to become the second most powerful man in the ancient world. We're exploring Joseph, whose prophetic dreams sparked murderous jealousy among his brothers, yet whose unwavering faith through betrayal and suffering positioned him to save entire nations from starvation. His story demonstrates how God can weave even the cruelest human actions into a tapestry of redemption that spans generations. It's a tale of family dysfunction, divine providence, and ultimate forgiveness that continues to inspire millions today. So let's step back nearly 4,000 years and witness how a teenager's coat of many colours became the opening scene of one of history's greatest comeback stories. In the rolling hills of Canaan, where Abraham once pitched his tents and Isaac dug his wells, the sun cast long shadows across the grazing lands of Jacob, son of Isaac, grandson of the great patriarch who had first heard God's promise to make of his descendants a mighty nation. The year was approximately 1728 BC, and the covenant that had echoed through 3 generations now rested upon the shoulders of a man whose very name meant supplanter. A man who had wrestled with God himself and emerged both wounded and blessed. Jacob's household sprawled across the landscape like a small city, a testament to both divine blessing and human complexity. 13 tents housed his wives, concubines, and children, while countless more sheltered servants, shepherds, and the ever-growing flocks that represented the family's wealth. The patriarch himself, now bearing the name Israel, he who wrestles with God, had lived long enough to see his hair turn silver and his once powerful frame bend under the weight of decades spent building what would become a nation. But within this prosperous camp, tension simmered like embers waiting for wind. The intricate family dynamics that had plagued Jacob's own generation, the rivalry between himself and Esau, the deception that had secured his birthright, now manifested in a new form among his 12 sons. These were not merely siblings sharing a household. They were the foundation stones of tribes, each destined to father multitudes, each carrying within their veins the covenant promise that stretched back to their great-grandfather Abraham. The complexity began with their mothers. Leah, the first wife, had been thrust upon Jacob through her father Laban's deception on what should have been Rachel's wedding night. Though unloved by her husband, she had borne him 6 sons in quick succession: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Her pain at being the unwanted wife had transmuted into fierce protective love for her children, and they carried within them both her strength and her resentment. Rachel, the beloved wife for whom Jacob had worked 14 years, had remained barren for agonizing years before finally bearing Joseph, when Jacob was already advanced in age. Her beauty had captured Jacob's heart from the moment he first saw her at the well, and her death in childbirth while bearing Benjamin had left Jacob inconsolable for months. The 2 sons she left behind became the repositories of all Jacob's frustrated love for his deceased wife. The servants Bilhah and Zilpah had each contributed 2 sons to the growing household: Dan and Naphtali from Bilhah, Gad and Asher from Zilpah, but their children occupied an ambiguous position in the family hierarchy. They were acknowledged sons of Jacob, inheritors of the covenant promise, yet always aware that their mother's status as concubines marked them as somehow lesser in the intricate social mathematics of patriarchal succession. Into this carefully balanced ecosystem of jealousy, ambition, and divine promise, Joseph had been born when Jacob was 91 years old. The circumstances of his birth had marked him as special from the beginning. After years of Rachel's barrenness, years of prayers and tears and desperate bargains with God, the child's arrival had seemed nothing short of miraculous. Jacob had looked upon the infant's face and seen not just a son, but the tangible proof that God had heard Rachel's cries and remembered his covenant. As Joseph grew from infant to child to adolescent, his special position in the household became increasingly apparent. While his older brothers spent their days in the fields with the flocks, learning the hard skills of survival, in a land where drought, raiders, and wild animals posed constant threats, Joseph remained closer to the family tents. Jacob, perhaps mindful of his own favoured position in Isaac's household, perhaps simply overwhelmed with love for Rachel's firstborn, made no attempt to hide his preference. The boy possessed an unusual combination of traits that both endeared him to his father and inflamed his brother's resentment. His intelligence was sharp and quick, capable of grasping complex concepts about trade, lineage, and the management of vast flocks. More troubling to his siblings, he displayed an unnerving ability to perceive things others missed. Subtle shifts in animal behaviour that predicted weather changes, insights into people's motivations that seemed beyond his years, and most disturbing of all, dreams that carried the weight of prophecy. Joseph's physical appearance also set him apart. While his brothers bore the weathered features of men who spent their lives under the harsh Middle Eastern sun, Joseph's skin remained smooth, his hands uncalloused by constant manual labour. He was tall for his age, with the kind of natural grace that suggested nobility of bearing. His eyes, inherited from Rachel, held an intensity that made people uncomfortable, as if he could see through surface pretences to deeper truths. The household's daily rhythm revolved around the ancient patterns of nomadic life. Before dawn, servants would kindle fires and begin preparing the simple meal of bread, milk and dried fruit that would sustain the family through the morning hours. The shepherds would lead the flocks to pasture, following routes that had been established through generations of experience with the land's seasonal patterns. Women would gather around the wells to draw water, their conversations weaving together the gossip, concerns, and wisdom that bound the community together. Jacob himself moved through these daily activities with the measured pace of a man who had learned that hasty decisions often carried generational consequences. His morning routine included prayers to the God of Abraham and Isaac, reminders to his sons about their duties, and careful attention to the reports brought by shepherds about the condition of the flocks. He was acutely aware that his wealth, measured in thousands of sheep, goats, and cattle, represented not just his own prosperity but the foundation upon which his sons would build their own futures. But it was in the evening hours, when the work was done and the family gathered around the central fire, that the household dynamics became most apparent. Here, as Jacob recounted the stories of their ancestors, Abraham's call from Ur, Isaac's near sacrifice on Mount Moriah, his own vision of angels ascending and descending a heavenly ladder, the careful observer could see how differently he looked at each of his sons. When his gaze fell upon Reuben, the firstborn, Jacob's expression carried a mixture of disappointment and resignation. Reuben possessed the physical strength and natural leadership qualities that should have made him an ideal heir, but his impulsive nature and moral weakness had already begun to manifest in troubling ways. The young man's inability to control his appetites would eventually lead to a scandal that would cost him his birthright, though that disgrace still lay in the future. Simeon and Levi, close in age and temperament, drew looks of wariness from their father. Both possessed fierce loyalty to family honour, but their methods of expressing that loyalty tended toward violence. They were the sons most likely to settle disputes with swords rather than negotiation, a trait that made Jacob nervous in a land where survival often depended on maintaining peaceful relationships with neighbouring tribes. Judah commanded more respect from his father, despite being the fourth son. There was something about the young man's bearing, his natural authority over his brothers, and his instinctive grasp of justice that suggested leadership potential. When disputes arose among the brothers, it was often Judah's voice that carried the most weight in settling them. Yet even he was not immune to the moral struggles that seemed to plague all of Jacob's sons. The middle sons, Issachar, Zebulun, and their half-brothers from the servant wives, received the kind of attention that dutiful children earn through steady reliability. They performed their assigned tasks without complaint, showed proper respect to their father, and generally avoided the dramatic conflicts that characterized their more volatile siblings. Yet Jacob's love for them, while genuine, lacked the passionate intensity he reserved for Rachel's children. And then there was Joseph. When Jacob's eyes found his second youngest son during these evening gatherings, his entire demeanour changed. His voice grew warmer, his posture more relaxed, his attention more focused. He would call the 17-year-old to sit beside him, sometimes asking for his opinion on matters of household management, sometimes simply enjoying his company in a way that made his other sons shift uncomfortably in the firelight. The favoritism had been building for years, but it reached its crescendo in what would become known throughout history as the coat of many colours. The garment itself was far more than a simple piece of clothing. It was a statement of inheritance, authority and destiny that could be read by anyone familiar with Near Eastern customs. The coat's construction had taken months. Jacob had commissioned it from the finest weavers in the region, specifying that it should be made from the best wool and dyed with the most expensive pigments available. The resulting garment was a masterpiece of ancient textile art, featuring intricate patterns woven in brilliant blues, deep purples, rich reds, and golden yellows. The sleeves extended to the wrists, and the hem fell nearly to the ankles, a design that proclaimed its wearer's freedom from manual labour. In the cultural context of Jacob's time, such a garment carried profound significance. While working men wore simple, practical tunics that allowed free movement for physical labour, this coat announced that its owner was destined for leadership, administration, and authority. It was the kind of garment worn by princes, governors, and other men of high station who ruled rather than toiled. When Jacob first presented the coat to Joseph, the entire household understood the implications immediately. This was not merely an expensive gift. It was a public declaration that Joseph, despite being the 11th son, was being positioned as Jacob's primary heir. The coat symbolized the transfer of the covenant blessing that had passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and would now apparently skip over 10 older brothers to rest upon Rachel's firstborn. The presentation ceremony took place during the evening meal, with all the brothers present and the household servants watching from the periphery. Jacob had called for silence, then stood with a magnificent garment draped over his arms. His voice, though weakened by age, carried clearly across the gathering as he spoke words that would echo through generations. "My son Joseph," he began, his eyes glistening with emotion, "receive this coat as a sign of my love and as a token of the blessing that rests upon our family. May the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob guide your steps and prosper your ways." As he placed the garment around Joseph's shoulders, the teenager stood straighter, unconsciously assuming the bearing of one marked for greatness. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Reuben's hands clenched into fists as he watched his birthright being symbolically transferred to a younger brother. Simeon and Levi exchanged glances that spoke of barely contained fury. Judah's face remained carefully neutral, but his jaw tightened in a way that suggested profound displeasure. Even the normally placid middle brothers showed signs of distress at this public humiliation. The coat's impact extended beyond the immediate family. Servants who had watched Jacob's sons grow to manhood now understood that the household's power structure was shifting in dramatic and unprecedented ways. Neighbouring tribal leaders, when they heard of the coat's presentation, began to recalculate their relationships with Jacob's family, wondering how this change in inheritance patterns might affect future alliances and trade agreements. For Joseph himself, wearing the coat proved to be both exhilarating and isolating. The garment's weight, both physical and symbolic, pressed upon his shoulders as a constant reminder of his father's expectations and his brother's resentment. He found himself moving differently, speaking more carefully, and becoming increasingly aware of his unique position within the family hierarchy. The coat also seemed to amplify abilities that had always set Joseph apart from his brothers. His dreams, which had been vivid since childhood, began to carry an intensity and clarity that suggested divine communication. His insights into people and situations became more pronounced, sometimes uncomfortably so. Most disturbing to his family, he began to display the kind of prophetic awareness that marked men chosen by God for special purposes. It was during this period of heightened tension and spiritual sensitivity that Joseph experienced the dreams that would change everything. The first came on a night when the autumn air carried the scent of coming rain, and the household had retired early after a long day of moving the flocks to new pasture. Joseph's sleep had been restless, filled with half-formed images and sensations that seemed to carry meaning beyond their apparent content. Then suddenly, the dream crystallized into perfect clarity. He found himself standing in a vast field during harvest time. the golden grain stretching to the horizon under a brilliant sun. He and his brothers were binding sheaves of wheat, their movements synchronized in the ancient rhythm of agricultural work. But as they labored, something extraordinary began to happen. Joseph's sheaf, as if possessed of its own life, rose upright in the centre of the field. Then, one by one, his brothers' sheaves began to move, bowing low around his own in gestures of unmistakable reverence and submission. The image was so vivid, so charged with significance, that Joseph woke with his heart pounding and the taste of prophecy strong in his mouth. The second dream came 3 nights later, and it was even more dramatic than the first. In this vision, Joseph found himself standing under the night sky, but it was unlike any sky he had ever seen. The sun, moon, and 11 stars moved with deliberate purpose across the heavens, their light more brilliant than natural celestial bodies. As he watched in wonder, these cosmic entities began to descend toward Earth, finally bowing before him in acknowledgement of some authority he possessed but did not yet understand. The dreams carried with them a certainty that transcended ordinary sleeping visions. Joseph knew with the kind of inner conviction that admits no doubt that he had received communications from the God of his fathers. These were not random products of an active imagination, but prophetic revelations about his future, and by extension the future of his entire family. The question was whether to share them. Joseph's youth and inexperience led him to make a decision that would prove catastrophic in the short term, though ultimately part of God's larger plan. Rather than keeping the dreams private or sharing them only with his father, he chose to recount them to his brothers during one of their evening gatherings. The first dream's telling was met with stunned silence, then mounting anger. Reuben's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "So you think we're going to bow down to you, little brother? You think your pretty coat makes you our master?" The other brothers joined in, their voices rising in indignation at what they saw as intolerable arrogance from their younger sibling. When Joseph shared the second dream, the reaction was even more explosive. The image of the sun, moon, and stars bowing before him could only be interpreted as a claim that his parents and all his brothers would someday acknowledge his supremacy. Even Jacob, who had shown such favoritism toward Joseph, felt compelled to rebuke him publicly. "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the earth before you?" Yet even as Jacob spoke these words of correction, the text notes that he kept the matter in mind. The old patriarch, who had himself received prophetic dreams and wrestled with divine messengers, recognized something authentic in his son's visions. While the dream's fulfillment seemed impossible given the current family dynamics, Jacob had learned through long experience that God's plans often unfolded in ways that defied human understanding. The brothers' hatred, already simmering due to the coat incident, now reached a dangerous boiling point. Joseph's dreams were not merely annoying examples of teenage grandiosity. They represented an existential threat to the established order of the family. If these visions were truly from God, then everything they had assumed about inheritance, authority, and their own futures would be overturned. In the months following the dream's revelation, the household atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Joseph's brothers could barely stand to be in his presence, their resentment fed by daily reminders of his favoured status. The sight of him in his magnificent coat moving with a confident bearing of one marked for greatness became a constant source of irritation. The situation was exacerbated by Joseph's continuing youth and relative inexperience with the delicate art of family diplomacy. Where a wiser person might have shown humility in the face of his brother's obvious hostility, Joseph seemed oblivious to the danger he was creating. His natural intelligence and spiritual insights, untempered by caution or discretion, led him to make observations and comments that further inflamed tensions. There were incidents. Joseph reporting to his father when his brothers were negligent in their duties, Joseph expressing opinions about family matters that his older siblings felt were beyond his proper sphere, Joseph carrying himself with an air that suggested he already considered the prophetic dreams to be fulfilled facts rather than future possibilities. Meanwhile, the ordinary business of the household continued. Flocks needed to be moved to fresh pasture, trade negotiations required attention, and the complex relationships with neighbouring tribes demanded careful management. But underneath these daily activities, a crisis was building that would soon explode in ways that would test every aspect of Jacob's family bonds. The brothers' conversations, when Joseph was not present, increasingly turned to the problem he represented. How could they tolerate a younger sibling who claimed divine authorization for his eventual dominance over them? How could they accept that their father's favoritism was apparently endorsed by God himself? The dreams had transformed what might have remained a manageable case of sibling rivalry into something far more dangerous. As winter turned to spring in Canaan's cycle of seasons, and the flocks grew fat on new grass, the stage was set for events that would scatter Jacob's family across hundreds of miles and test whether the covenant promises made to Abraham could survive the very human failures of his descendants. Joseph, still wearing his magnificent coat and still confident in his prophetic dreams, remained unaware that his brother's hatred had progressed far beyond mere resentment. The young man who had been marked for greatness was about to discover that the path to fulfilling God's purposes often leads through valleys of suffering that would test every aspect of his faith, character, and endurance. The dreams of sheaves and stars bowing before him would indeed come to pass, but not before he experienced depths of betrayal, injustice, and abandonment that would transform him from a favoured son into something far more valuable, a man prepared by adversity to serve as God's instrument for the salvation of nations. In the gathering twilight of one particular evening, as Joseph sat beside his father listening to another recounting of the promises made to Abraham, neither of them could have imagined that within a few short weeks their family would be shattered by an act of betrayal so profound that its consequences would echo through the next 4 centuries of their descendants' history. The coat of many colours would soon be stained with blood. The dreams would seem like cruel mockeries, and Joseph himself would begin a journey that would take him to the very depths of human experience before lifting him to heights of power and influence that would make his adolescent visions seem modest by comparison. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of how God's sovereignty can work through human hatred, transforming even the cruelest betrayals into instruments of divine purpose and ultimate redemption. The crisis that had been building for months in Jacob's household reached its breaking point on what should have been an ordinary spring day in 1727 BC. The flocks had been moved north to graze near Shechem, a journey of several days from the family's main camp near Hebron. It was good pasture land, but the distance meant the older brothers would be gone for weeks, managing the herds in territory that required constant vigilance against both wild animals and potential raiders. For Jacob, sitting in his tent as the weeks stretched on without word from his sons, the silence became increasingly troubling. In a land where communication travelled only as fast as human feet or donkey caravans, extended periods without contact could mean anything from delayed travel due to weather to devastating attacks by hostile tribes. The old patriarch's anxiety grew with each passing day, fed by memories of his own family's violent history in the Shechem region. Decades earlier, his daughter Dinah had been violated by Shechem, the son of the local ruler. The subsequent revenge taken by Simeon and Levi, who had slaughtered every male in the city while they were recovering from circumcision, had made the name of Jacob's family feared throughout the region. Though years had passed, the possibility of retaliation always lurked in the background when his sons ventured into that territory. As the father's concern mounted, he made a decision that would trigger one of history's most consequential acts of sibling rivalry. He would send Joseph to check on his brothers and bring back word of their welfare. It seemed like a simple, reasonable solution to his growing anxiety. Joseph could make the journey in a few days, assess the situation, and return with the reassurance Jacob desperately needed. The irony of this decision would only become apparent later. Jacob was sending the son his other children hated most, to spy on them in their moment of freedom from paternal oversight. He was placing Joseph, still wearing his magnificent coat and carrying himself with the confidence of his father's chosen heir, directly into the hands of brothers whose resentment had been festering for months. When Jacob called Joseph to his tent that morning, the 17-year-old responded with the eager obedience that had always characterized his relationship with his father. "Go now," Jacob instructed, his weathered hands resting on Joseph's shoulders. "See if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring me word again." The Hebrew phrase he used, shalom, meaning peace or welfare, carried deep significance in a culture where family harmony was essential for survival. Joseph's journey north took him first to Shechem, where he expected to find his brothers grazing the flocks in the familiar pasture lands. But when he arrived, the fields were empty except for a man he encountered wandering in the area. This stranger, whose identity the ancient narrative leaves mysteriously vague, informed Joseph that his brothers had moved on to Dothan, another day's journey to the north. The additional travel meant Joseph would be gone longer than expected, but his father's instructions had been clear: find the brothers and assess their welfare. So the young man pressed on, his colourful coat marking him as a person of importance to anyone who might observe his passage along the ancient trade routes that connected Egypt with the civilizations of Mesopotamia. Dothan sat strategically positioned along one of these major thoroughfares, a place where caravans regularly stopped to rest and resupply before continuing their journeys. It was here, in this crossroads of ancient commerce, that the threads of divine providence would weave together in ways that would alter the course of nations. The brothers saw Joseph coming from a great distance. In the flat terrain around Dothan, a lone traveller could be spotted while still miles away, especially one wearing a garment as distinctive as Joseph's coat. As the colourful figure grew larger on the horizon, the men who had been tending their flocks felt their long-suppressed rage crystallise into something far more dangerous. "Look, this dreamer is coming," one of them said, the Hebrew word for dreamer carrying a tone of bitter mockery. Here was the brother who claimed the sun, moon and stars would bow before him, approaching them in his royal garment while they laboured in the dust with the animals. The contrast between his pampered appearance and their weathered, work-hardened state only intensified their resentment. What happened next revealed the depths to which human jealousy can sink when unchecked by conscience or divine restraint. "Come now, let us kill him and cast him into some pit," the brothers conspired among themselves. "We will say that a wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams." The casual way they planned murder, discussing it as if it were merely another task to be accomplished, like shearing sheep or repairing a broken well, demonstrates how thoroughly hatred had corrupted their hearts. These were men who had been raised in the covenant tradition, who had heard from childhood the stories of God's promises to their forefathers, yet they were now plotting fratricide with the cold calculation of professional assassins. Only Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility that should have stayed their hands. As the firstborn, he bore accountability for the family's welfare in their father's absence. The murder of a brother would bring devastating consequences not just to Joseph, but to the entire household. Beyond practical considerations, Reuben may have retained enough conscience to be horrified by what his siblings were contemplating. "Let us not kill him," Reuben argued, his voice carrying the authority of his position as the eldest. "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him." His words offered a compromise that seemed to satisfy the brothers' immediate bloodlust, while secretly preserving Joseph's life. Reuben's plan was to return later, when his brothers were distracted, and rescue Joseph from the cistern. The pit they selected was one of many scattered across the landscape, ancient water storage systems carved from solid rock and designed to capture and hold the precious rainfall that sustained life in this semi-arid region. During the dry season, many of these cisterns stood empty, their depths offering perfect prisons for anyone unfortunate enough to be lowered into them. The sides were too smooth and steep for anyone to climb out without assistance, making escape virtually impossible. When Joseph finally reached his brother's camp, his greeting was met not with the customary expressions of family affection, but with violent action that gave him no time to comprehend what was happening. Hands seized him roughly, stripping away the magnificent coat that had become the symbol of his favoured status. The careful stitching that had taken skilled craftsmen months to complete was torn and damaged in their haste to remove it. the brilliant colours that had proclaimed his destiny now dishevelled and stained with dirt. Standing there in his simple undergarment, Joseph was transformed in an instant from a prince to a prisoner. The coat that had marked him as his father's heir lay crumpled in the dust, its beauty marred but its symbolic power still capable of serving the brothers' deceptive purposes. Without the garment that had distinguished him, Joseph appeared as vulnerable as any other young man, though the shock and confusion in his eyes marked him as someone unprepared for the brutality he was experiencing. The brothers then seized him and lowered him into the pit. The ancient narrative notes with stark simplicity that the pit was empty, there was no water in it. This detail emphasizes both Joseph's immediate predicament. He would not drown, but neither would he have access to the water necessary for survival, and the calculated nature of his brother's cruelty. They were condemning him to a slow death by thirst and exposure. As Joseph's voice echoed from the depths of the cistern, pleading for mercy and trying to understand why his own brothers had turned against him so violently, the men who had cast him there displayed a chilling indifference to his suffering. They sat down to eat their meal as if nothing unusual had occurred, the sounds of their brother's distress providing an unfortunate soundtrack to their bread and dried fruit. This moment reveals the depths of moral callousness to which human hearts can sink when consumed by envy and resentment. These were not strangers or enemies, but brothers who had grown up together, shared the same tents, heard the same stories of their ancestors' faith, and inherited the same covenant promises. Yet their hatred had so thoroughly corrupted their natural affections that they could literally feast while their brother suffered mere yards away. It was while they were eating that they noticed the caravan approaching from the north. A line of camels loaded with goods appeared on the horizon, following the ancient trade route that connected Damascus with Egypt. As the procession drew closer, the brothers could identify it as a merchant caravan of Ishmaelites, descendants of Abraham through his son by Hagar, and therefore distant relatives, though the family connection had long since ceased to carry any practical significance. The caravan's cargo told the story of international commerce in the ancient world. They carried gum, balm and myrrh, valuable spices and medicinal substances that commanded high prices in Egyptian markets. These aromatic resins, harvested from trees that grew in the Arabian Peninsula and the lands east of Jordan, represented the kind of luxury goods that made the dangerous journey across hundreds of miles of desert profitable for enterprising merchants. Seeing the caravan sparked a new idea in Judah's mind, one that would prove fateful for the entire family's future. "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood?" he asked his siblings. "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." The proposal combined practical benefits with a thin veneer of moral justification. They could profit from Joseph's removal while technically avoiding the sin of murder. The suggestion appealed to the brothers for multiple reasons. Killing Joseph outright would require disposing of his body and maintaining a deception that might eventually be discovered. Selling him to slave traders would remove him permanently from their lives while providing them with silver for their trouble. Most importantly, it would place his ultimate fate in other hands, allowing them to maintain the fiction that they were not directly responsible for whatever happened to him afterward. The price they negotiated was 20 shekels of silver, approximately 2 years' wages for a labourer, but a pittance compared to what a healthy young man might earn over a lifetime of labour. In the cold mathematics of the ancient slave trade, Joseph's future was valued at less than the cost of a good horse. The irony that this price precisely matched the 30 pieces of silver that would later be paid for Christ's betrayal was not lost on later interpreters of the story. When the brothers pulled Joseph from the pit and presented him to the Ishmaelite traders, the young man's world collapsed entirely. Everything he had believed about his place in the family, his father's protection, and his prophetic destiny seemed to crumble in the space of a few horrific hours. The dreams of sheaves and stars bowing before him now appeared to be cruel mockeries, divine jokes at the expense of a naive teenager who had misunderstood his place in God's plan. The slave merchants evaluated Joseph with the practiced eyes of men who dealt in human property as casually as others traded in livestock. They saw a healthy young man, well-fed and clearly unaccustomed to hard labour, who would likely fetch a good price in the Egyptian markets. His obvious education and intelligence would make him valuable for household service or administrative work, while his youth meant many productive years lay ahead. As the silver changed hands and Joseph was bound for the journey south, his brothers experienced the complex emotions that follow irreversible actions. There was satisfaction in finally being rid of the brother who had tormented them with his dreams and his father's favoritism. There was relief that they had avoided actual murder while still removing the source of their resentment. But there was also the beginning awareness that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Reuben, who had been absent during the sale, perhaps attending to some business with the flocks, returned to find the pit empty and his secret plan to rescue Joseph thwarted. His reaction was immediate and dramatic. He tore his clothes in the traditional gesture of grief and mourning. "The child is no more," he cried to his brothers, "and where shall I go?" As the eldest, he would bear primary responsibility for explaining Joseph's disappearance to their father. The brothers now faced the practical problem of accounting for Joseph's absence. They had removed him from their lives, but they still needed to explain his disappearance in a way that would deflect suspicion from themselves. The solution they devised was as cruel as it was clever. They would stage evidence of Joseph's death by wild animals, using his distinctive coat as proof of the tragedy. Taking the magnificent garment that had symbolized Joseph's favored status, they killed a young goat and dipped the coat in its blood. The rich fabric, with its intricate patterns and brilliant colors, became a canvas for their deception. The bloodstains, strategically applied, would tell a story of violence that would devastate their father while concealing their own guilt. The journey back to Jacob's camp near Hebron took several days, during which the brothers had ample time to rehearse their story and steel themselves for the performance they would need to give. They would need to appear as grieving siblings, shocked by the tragedy that had befallen their family, convincing enough in their sorrow to avoid any suspicion of complicity. When they finally arrived home and presented the bloodied coat to their father, their deception achieved its intended effect with devastating efficiency. Jacob recognized the garment immediately. Every thread, every pattern, every carefully chosen color was familiar to him, as the work he had commissioned as a token of his love. Seeing it torn and stained with blood triggered a grief so profound that it would mark the rest of his life. "It is my son's coat," Jacob cried, his voice breaking as he examined the evidence of what appeared to be his beloved son's violent death. "A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces." The Hebrew phrase he used, taref toref, emphasized the violence of what he believed had occurred, conjuring images of his son's body being torn apart by lions or bears. Jacob's response to the apparent loss of Joseph revealed the depths of his attachment to Rachel's firstborn. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, the rough fabric worn during periods of mourning, and refused all attempts at comfort from his remaining children. "I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning," he declared, establishing a grief that would endure for decades. The brothers who had orchestrated this deception now found themselves trapped in a lie that grew more burdensome with each passing day. Every time they saw their father's tear-stained face, every time they heard him speak Joseph's name with longing, they were confronted with the magnitude of what they had done. Yet none of them possessed the courage to confess the truth and face the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, Joseph himself was experiencing the brutal realities of the ancient slave trade. The journey to Egypt took the Ishmaelite caravan through some of the most desolate terrain in the ancient world. Across the Sinai Peninsula, where water was scarce and the sun merciless. Bound with the other human cargo, the young man who had never known physical hardship was subjected to conditions that tested every aspect of his endurance. The psychological trauma was perhaps even worse than the physical suffering. Joseph had been violently torn from everything familiar: his father's love, his position of privilege, his sense of identity as the chosen heir. The dreams that had once filled him with confidence now seemed like bitter reminders of how completely his life had been derailed. Where once he had imagined his brothers bowing before him, now he was literally in chains, his future entirely dependent on the whims of slave merchants. Yet even in these darkest circumstances, the ancient narrative suggests that Joseph's character began to reveal qualities that would eventually elevate him far beyond his brother's capacity for vision. Rather than succumbing to despair or self-pity, he began to demonstrate the resilience, intelligence, and spiritual depth that would mark his entire life. The teenager who had been pampered in his father's house was being forged in the crucible of suffering into someone capable of bearing enormous responsibilities. The caravan's destination was Egypt, the ancient world's most sophisticated civilization, and a land that would become Joseph's home for the rest of his life. As the pyramids appeared on the horizon and the fertile Nile Delta spread before them, Joseph could hardly have imagined that he was approaching not just a new phase of slavery, but the theatre where his prophetic dreams would eventually be fulfilled in ways more dramatic than anything he had envisioned in his father's tents. The brothers' betrayal, which seemed to represent the complete destruction of God's plan for Joseph's life, was actually the essential first step in a divine strategy that would position him to save not only his own family but entire nations from starvation. The pit that was meant to be his grave became instead the gateway to his destiny, and the silver that purchased his freedom from family bonds would ultimately purchase freedom from famine for millions of people. As the caravan disappeared into the distance, carrying Joseph toward an uncertain future in a foreign land, the stage was set for one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of how divine providence can transform human evil into instruments of salvation. The coat of many colours now lay bloodied and abandoned, but the dreams it had symbolised were far from dead. They were simply waiting for their fulfilment in ways that would prove God's ability to work through the darkest circumstances to accomplish his purposes. The Memphis slave market in 1727 BC pulsed with the harsh rhythms of human commerce, a sprawling complex of holding pens, auction blocks, and merchant stalls where lives were bought and sold with the same casual efficiency applied to livestock or grain. The air hung thick with dust, sweat, and the mingled scents of exotic spices carried by traders from across the known world. Here, beneath the shadow of ancient pyramids that had already stood for 1,000 years, Joseph experienced his first taste of Egyptian civilization. The young Hebrew who had once worn a coat of many colours now stood naked on the auction platform, his body marked with the chalk symbols that indicated his health, age, and estimated capabilities. The slave merchants had cleaned him up for sale, but no amount of preparation could disguise the shock and bewilderment that lingered in his eyes. Everything about this environment was alien to someone raised in the pastoral simplicity of Canaan. The cacophony of multiple languages, the sophisticated urban architecture, the casual brutality with which human beings were reduced to mere property. Egypt in the 18th century BC represented the pinnacle of ancient civilization. The Middle Kingdom was experiencing a golden age of prosperity, artistic achievement, and administrative sophistication that made other nations seem primitive by comparison. The Nile's annual floods had been particularly generous in recent years, filling the royal granaries and funding ambitious building projects that employed thousands of workers. Trade flowed along well-established routes that connected Egypt with Nubia to the south, the Levant to the northeast, and distant lands whose exotic goods filled the markets of Memphis and Thebes. Into this world of power and privilege stepped the buyer who would change Joseph's life forever. Potiphar was one of Pharaoh's most trusted officials, holding the title of Captain of the Guard, a position that made him responsible for the personal security of the royal household and the administration of Egypt's military police. His very presence in the slave market indicated both his wealth and his practical approach to household management. Unlike many nobles who delegated such mundane tasks to subordinates, Potiphar personally selected the slaves who would serve in his extensive household. What drew Potiphar's attention to Joseph among the dozens of slaves available that day remains one of those mysterious workings of providence that characterized the young Hebrew's entire story. Perhaps it was Joseph's obvious intelligence, evident even in his present degraded circumstances. Perhaps it was his physical bearing, which retained traces of the noble confidence he had displayed in his father's house. Or perhaps Potiphar simply recognized something indefinable, a quality of character that suggested this particular slave might prove more valuable than his current price indicated. The transaction was completed with Egyptian efficiency. Potiphar paid the asking price without haggling, had his new purchase properly documented in the official records, and arranged for Joseph to be transported to his estate on the outskirts of Memphis. For Joseph, this sale represented both relief and terror. Relief at being removed from the dehumanizing environment of the slave market, terror at the complete uncertainty of what lay ahead in service to this imposing Egyptian official. Potiphar's house was a revelation of wealth and sophistication that far exceeded anything Joseph had imagined during his sheltered upbringing in Canaan. The estate sprawled across several acres, encompassing not just the main residence but also workshops, storage facilities, servant quarters, and elaborate gardens that demonstrated the Egyptian mastery of irrigation and landscape design. The main house itself was built in the traditional Egyptian style, with thick walls designed to provide relief from the desert heat, courtyards that channeled cooling breezes, and decorative elements that proclaimed the owner's high status in Pharaoh's court. The household staff numbered in the dozens, a complex hierarchy of servants, craftsmen, administrators, and guards that reflected Potiphar's important position in Egyptian society. There were scribes who maintained detailed records of the estate's operations, overseers who managed specific departments, skilled craftsmen who produced goods for both household use and trade, and domestic servants who attended to the daily needs of Potiphar and his wife. Into this established system, Joseph was introduced as the lowest-ranking member, assigned to menial tasks that would allow the household supervisors to evaluate his capabilities. Joseph's initial weeks in Potiphar's service were a brutal education in both Egyptian customs and the realities of slave life. The language barrier was immediate and formidable. While Joseph had grown up speaking Hebrew and Aramaic, he now found himself immersed in the complex hieroglyphic writing system and spoken Egyptian that governed all official communication. The cultural differences were equally challenging as he struggled to understand the intricate social protocols, religious observances and behavioral expectations that defined life in an Egyptian noble's household. Yet even as Joseph grappled with these overwhelming adjustments, certain qualities began to distinguish him from his fellow servants. His intelligence was evident in how quickly he absorbed new information and adapted to unfamiliar situations. His work ethic, shaped by the pastoral lifestyle of his youth, translated well to the demanding requirements of household service. Most importantly, his character, even in these reduced circumstances, displayed an integrity and reliability that supervisors noticed and appreciated. The Hebrew concept of working as unto the Lord, which Joseph had absorbed from his father's teaching about the covenant God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, transformed even menial labour into something approaching worship. While other slaves performed their duties with the grudging compliance of the coerced, Joseph approached each task with a thoroughness and attention to detail that suggested personal investment in the outcome. This attitude, so foreign to the typical slave mentality, could not help but attract attention in a household where efficiency and reliability were highly valued. Within months, Joseph's competence had earned him promotion to more responsible positions within the household hierarchy. He was assigned to assist with record-keeping, a task that revealed his quick grasp of Egyptian administrative practices and his natural aptitude for organization. His recommendations for improving storage procedures and inventory management proved so valuable that he was given authority over entire sections of the estate's operations. Potiphar himself began to take notice of this remarkable slave, who seemed to transform everything he touched. Departments that had been plagued by inefficiency suddenly ran smoothly when Joseph was placed in charge. Financial records that had been confused and incomplete became models of clarity and accuracy under his supervision. Even the household staff, initially resentful of taking orders from a foreign slave, came to respect Joseph's fair dealing and obvious competence. The ancient narrative records that the Lord was with Joseph and he was a successful man. This divine favour manifested itself not in miraculous interventions, but in the practical blessing that seemed to accompany Joseph's efforts. Projects he managed succeeded beyond expectations. Problems he addressed found elegant solutions. Resources under his care multiplied and prospered in ways that defied ordinary explanation. Potiphar, though a pagan Egyptian who knew nothing of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was pragmatic enough to recognize supernatural blessing when he saw it. The correlation between Joseph's involvement in household affairs and the general prosperity of the estate was too obvious to ignore. Rather than being threatened by his slave's unusual abilities, Potiphar had the wisdom to capitalize on them. The promotion that followed was unprecedented in its scope. Potiphar appointed Joseph as overseer of his entire household, granting him authority over all other servants and responsibility for managing every aspect of the estate's operations. In practical terms, Joseph became the equivalent of a chief operating officer, with only Potiphar himself holding higher authority within the household structure. This elevation brought Joseph face to face with the complexities of Egyptian high society, as he was required to interact with merchants, officials, and other members of the nobility who conducted business with Potiphar. His intelligence and natural diplomatic skills served him well in these encounters, earning respect even from those who might otherwise have looked down on a Hebrew slave. The young man who had once dreamed of his brothers bowing before him was now in a position where Egyptian nobles sought his favour and approval. The responsibility was enormous. Joseph oversaw agricultural operations that produced food for hundreds of people, managed financial investments that involved substantial sums of silver and gold, and supervised trade relationships that connected Potiphar's household with merchants throughout the ancient world. The trust Potiphar placed in him was demonstrated by the Egyptian's willingness to delegate virtually all decision-making authority to his Hebrew slave. The narrative notes that Potiphar did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. This was not negligence, but rather the ultimate expression of confidence in Joseph's management abilities. The Egyptian official felt secure enough in his slave's competence and integrity to focus entirely on his official duties as captain of the guard, knowing that his personal affairs were in capable hands. For Joseph, this period represented both the fulfillment of his natural gifts and a profound test of his character. The teenager who had been pampered in his father's house was now bearing responsibilities that would have challenged men twice his age. The dreams that had once seemed like guarantees of easy elevation were being fulfilled through years of diligent service and personal growth that transformed him from a naive youth into a capable administrator. Yet success brought its own temptations and dangers. Joseph's elevated position in the household made him a prominent figure in Memphis society, his intelligence and administrative skills earning recognition that extended far beyond Potiphar's estate. His physical appearance, matured from adolescence into young manhood during his years of service, drew attention that he neither sought nor welcomed. The most dangerous of these attentions came from within Potiphar's own household. The captain's wife, accustomed to the privileges and pleasures that came with her husband's high position, found herself increasingly fascinated by the Hebrew slave who had risen to such prominence in her household. Joseph's combination of intelligence, capability, and integrity presented a striking contrast to the typical Egyptian courtiers who populated her social circle. The woman's interest in Joseph began subtly, with small gestures of favoritism that might have seemed like simple appreciation for his excellent service. She would seek his opinion on household matters that fell within her sphere of authority, engage him in conversations that stretched beyond strictly business topics, and create opportunities for private interactions that gradually became more frequent and more intimate in nature. Joseph, for his part, recognized the dangerous territory he was entering long before the woman's intentions became explicit. His years in Egyptian society had given him a thorough education in the complex dynamics of power, sexuality, and social relationships that governed interactions between masters and slaves. He understood that any involvement with Potiphar's wife would not only violate his moral principles, but also place him in a position of extreme vulnerability within the household hierarchy. The woman's advances escalated gradually but persistently. What began as seemingly innocent conversations evolved into more direct expressions of interest, and eventually into explicit propositions that left no doubt about her intentions. "Lie with me," she said, abandoning all pretense of subtlety in favour of direct command. Her position as mistress of the household gave her authority over Joseph that made refusal both dangerous and difficult. Joseph's response revealed the depths of character that had been forged through his years of suffering and service. His refusal was grounded not in calculation about potential consequences, but in fundamental principles about right and wrong that transcended immediate considerations of safety or advancement. "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand," Joseph replied. "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" The moral reasoning Joseph employed was remarkable for its sophistication and its grounding in divine rather than merely human authority. He recognized his obligation to Potiphar, who had shown him extraordinary trust and kindness. He acknowledged the special status of marriage as an institution that deserved protection, regardless of the personal cost to himself. Most significantly, he identified the ultimate issue as one of rebellion against God rather than merely a violation of human social conventions. This refusal, delivered with respectful firmness but absolute finality, should have ended the matter. Instead, it served only to intensify the woman's desire and her determination to overcome Joseph's resistance. Day after day, she renewed her advances, using every tool of persuasion, manipulation, and coercion at her disposal. She appealed to his ambition, suggesting that compliance would enhance his position in the household. She threatened his security, implying that continued refusal might result in punishment or dismissal. She attempted to wear down his resolve through sheer persistence, confronting him repeatedly with propositions that became increasingly difficult to navigate gracefully. Joseph's strategy for handling this impossible situation demonstrated wisdom beyond his years. He avoided being alone with the woman whenever possible, arranging his schedule and responsibilities to minimize opportunities for private encounters. When such encounters proved unavoidable, he maintained professional courtesy while making his position absolutely clear through both words and actions. He refused to engage in the kind of flirtation or ambiguous communication that might encourage her advances while still allowing him to claim innocence if questioned. The situation reached its climax on a day when circumstances conspired to place Joseph in maximum danger. The narrative records that he entered the house to perform his duties when none of the other household staff were present. Whether this isolation was coincidental or deliberately arranged by Potiphar's wife, it created the perfect opportunity for her to make one final, desperate attempt to achieve her desires. What followed was a scene of attempted seduction that quickly escalated into something approaching assault. The woman seized Joseph's outer garment, using her physical grip on his clothing to prevent his escape while renewing her demands with increased urgency and boldness. "Lie with me," she commanded, her tone leaving no doubt that she considered this a direct order from a superior to a subordinate. Joseph's response was immediate and decisive. Rather than attempt to reason with her or negotiate some face-saving compromise, he simply fled, leaving his garment in her hands as he escaped from the house. The symbolism of this moment was profound. Once again, Joseph's clothing became a crucial element in a crisis that would reshape his destiny. Where his coat of many colours had been used to deceive his father about his supposed death, now his servant's garment would be used to fabricate evidence of attempted rape. The woman's reaction to Joseph's escape revealed the depths of malice that can emerge when rejected. Pride combines with fear of exposure. She now possessed the means to transform herself from rejected pursuer into wronged victim, and she used that opportunity with calculating ruthlessness. When the other servants returned to the house, she presented them with Joseph's garment as evidence of his alleged assault upon her honour. "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to mock us," she declared, appealing to both Egyptian prejudice against foreigners and the servants' potential resentment of Joseph's elevated position. "He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and it happened, when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside." The accusation was masterfully crafted to exploit every possible source of support for her version of events. By emphasizing Joseph's Hebrew origins, she portrayed the incident as an ethnic affront to Egyptian dignity. By claiming that her cries had driven him away, she explained the presence of his garment while positioning herself as the victim of attempted violence. By suggesting that Potiphar had been foolish to trust a foreign slave with such authority, she deflected any suspicion that her own behaviour might have contributed to the situation. When Potiphar returned home that evening, his wife repeated her performance with even greater dramatic effect. The presence of Joseph's garment provided tangible evidence that seemed to corroborate her claims, while her apparent distress and righteous indignation created a compelling picture of violated innocence. For Potiphar, the situation presented an impossible dilemma that tested every aspect of his judgment and character. On one hand, he had observed Joseph's character and integrity for years, watching him transform every aspect of the household through his diligent and honest service. The idea that this paragon of reliability and moral rectitude would suddenly attempt to assault his master's wife seemed inconsistent with everything Potiphar had witnessed about Joseph's nature. On the other hand, he was confronted with his wife's tears, her detailed account of the alleged assault, and the physical evidence of Joseph's garment abandoned in their bedroom. To disbelieve her claims would be to accuse his own wife of fabricating an elaborate deception for reasons that made no sense. Moreover, in Egyptian society, a husband who failed to defend his wife's honour against such accusations would face social disgrace and potential political consequences. The rage that consumed Potiphar upon hearing his wife's account may have been genuine, or it may have been the calculated response of a man who understood the political necessities of his position. Either way, his reaction was swift and decisive. Joseph was arrested, stripped of all authority, and consigned to the royal prison where political prisoners and others who had offended the crown were held pending judgment. Yet even in this moment of apparent triumph for injustice, hints of divine providence remained visible to those with eyes to see them. The prison to which Joseph was sent was not the common dungeon where ordinary criminals awaited execution or brutal punishment. Instead, it was the facility where Pharaoh's own prisoners were confined, men whose crimes were political rather than criminal, whose treatment reflected their former status even as they awaited royal judgment. Moreover, Potiphar's decision to imprison rather than execute Joseph suggested that some doubt lingered in the Egyptian's mind about the true nature of what had occurred. Under Egyptian law, a slave who assaulted his master's wife could expect immediate death as punishment. The fact that Joseph remained alive indicated that Potiphar, despite his public rage, retained enough uncertainty about the situation to settle for imprisonment rather than execution. As the prison gates closed behind Joseph, the young man who had risen from slavery to the heights of household authority found himself once again stripped of everything except his faith in the God of his fathers. The dreams that had sustained him through his initial captivity now seemed more distant than ever. The integrity that had guided his refusal of Potiphar's wife had cost him everything he had gained through years of faithful service. Yet the narrative that had begun with dreams of divine destiny was far from over. The prison that seemed to represent the final destruction of Joseph's hopes would instead become the staging ground for his ultimate elevation to power beyond anything his adolescent visions had imagined. The God who had been with him in his father's house, in the slave market, and in Potiphar's household would prove equally present in the depths of royal imprisonment, working through human injustice to accomplish divine purposes that would eventually benefit not just Joseph himself, but entire nations facing the spectre of devastating famine. The royal prison of Memphis stood like a fortress within the capital city, its massive limestone walls designed to contain not common criminals, but men whose offences against Pharaoh's government or person required special handling. Built during the reign of an earlier dynasty, the complex housed political prisoners, disgraced officials, and others whose crimes were considered threats to royal authority. Into this grim environment Joseph was thrust in 1724 BC, his fall from trusted household administrator to accused criminal complete in the space of a single day. The transition from Potiphar's luxurious estate to the harsh realities of royal imprisonment was jarring beyond description. Where Joseph had grown accustomed to spacious rooms, fine furnishings, and the respect accorded to a trusted administrator, he now found himself in a cramped cell with stone walls that wept moisture, and floors that never fully dried. The accommodations, while better than those provided to common criminals, were still designed to remind their occupants of their complete dependence on royal mercy. The prison population consisted of men who had once wielded considerable power within Egypt's complex governmental hierarchy. Former governors who had fallen from Pharaoh's favour, military commanders whose loyalty had come under suspicion, court officials whose ambitions had exceeded their discretion, all found themselves reduced to the same level of powerless uncertainty about their futures. Some had been imprisoned for months, others for years, their cases forgotten in the labyrinthine bureaucracy that governed ancient Egypt's judicial system. The keeper of the prison, a career official named in the ancient records simply as the chief jailer, possessed the practical wisdom that comes from years of managing difficult men in impossible circumstances. He had learned to recognise which prisoners could be trusted with responsibilities and which required constant supervision. The administrative skills that made the prison function smoothly depended on identifying inmates who could serve as intermediaries between the official staff and the general prison population. Joseph's reputation had preceded him into the prison. The story of his meteoric rise in Potiphar's household and his dramatic fall following accusations of assault had spread through Memphis society with a speed that scandal always achieves in close-knit communities. Some prisoners viewed him with suspicion, wondering if his supposed integrity was merely careful calculation that had finally been exposed. Others saw in his situation a reflection of their own experiences with the capricious nature of Egyptian justice. But the chief jailer was more interested in practical considerations than in prison gossip. Within days of Joseph's arrival, he had identified qualities in the young Hebrew that made him valuable for maintaining order and efficiency within the prison population. Joseph's natural leadership abilities, his experience with administrative responsibilities, and his obvious intelligence marked him as someone who could be trusted with significant authority even in his reduced circumstances. The pattern that had characterized Joseph's time in Potiphar's household began to repeat itself within the prison walls. Tasks assigned to him were completed with unusual thoroughness and efficiency. Problems that had plagued prison operations for months found elegant solutions when placed under his supervision. Other prisoners, initially resentful of taking direction from a newcomer, gradually came to respect his fair dealing and obvious competence. The ancient narrative records that the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favour in the sight of the keeper of the prison. This divine favour manifested itself not through miraculous interventions that would have been impossible to ignore, but through the practical blessing that seemed to accompany Joseph's efforts regardless of his circumstances. Projects he managed succeeded beyond expectations, conflicts he mediated found peaceful resolutions, and resources under his care were stretched to meet needs that should have exceeded their capacity. Within months, the chief jailer had placed Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners, making him essentially a deputy administrator responsible for the day-to-day operations of the entire facility. This unprecedented trust was based not on favoritism or bribery, but on the demonstrable results that followed Joseph's involvement in prison affairs. The chief jailer, like Potiphar before him, was pragmatic enough to recognize supernatural blessing when he saw it, regardless of his understanding of its source. Joseph's elevation within the prison hierarchy brought him into contact with a remarkable variety of men whose stories illuminated the complex political dynamics of Egyptian society. There were provincial governors who had been accused of embezzling tax revenues, military officers whose strategic failures had cost Egyptian lives, court officials whose loyalty to rival claimants for succession had placed them on the wrong side of palace intrigue. Each carried with him the bitter knowledge of how quickly fortune could change in the volatile world of ancient politics. These conversations provided Joseph with an invaluable education in the workings of Egyptian government and society that would prove crucial to his future success. He learned about the intricate web of relationships that connected various governmental departments, the competing interests that shaped royal policy, and the personal dynamics among Pharaoh's advisors that influenced major decisions. This knowledge, acquired through countless hours of listening to the stories and complaints of his fellow prisoners, gave him insights into Egyptian power structures that few outsiders ever obtained. Yet even as Joseph adapted to his new circumstances and began to find purpose in his prison responsibilities, the deeper questions about his destiny remained unresolved. The dreams that had marked him as special in his father's household, visions of sheaves and celestial bodies bowing before him, seemed like cruel mockeries in his current situation. How could a man destined for greatness find himself twice reduced to the lowest possible circumstances, first as a slave and now as a prisoner accused of sexual assault? The theological implications of his situation weighed heavily on Joseph's mind during the long nights when sleep eluded him, and the stone walls seemed to press inward with the weight of his isolation. Had he misunderstood the meaning of his adolescent dreams? Had his confidence in divine destiny been nothing more than youthful arrogance? Or was this prolonged suffering somehow part of a larger plan that he lacked the wisdom to comprehend? These questions gained a new urgency when two significant prisoners joined the general population in 1721 BC. Pharaoh's chief butler and chief baker had been arrested following some unspecified offence against the royal household and were awaiting judgment on their cases. Both men held positions of enormous trust and influence within the palace hierarchy, with direct access to Pharaoh's person and intimate knowledge of court affairs. The butler's responsibilities extended far beyond simply serving drinks to the royal household. In ancient Egypt, this position involved oversight of all palace beverages, responsibility for detecting potential poisoning attempts, and management of the elaborate protocols that governed royal meals and entertainments. The trust required for such duties made the chief butler one of Pharaoh's most intimate advisors, someone whose loyalty was essential to royal security. The chief baker held equally sensitive responsibilities, with authority over all food preparation for the royal household and accountability for preventing assassination attempts through poisoned meals. Like the butler, he possessed detailed knowledge of palace routines, personal access to Pharaoh, and influence that extended throughout the governmental hierarchy. The fact that both men had been imprisoned simultaneously suggested either a coordinated conspiracy against the throne or a security scare that had prompted wholesale replacement of key palace personnel. Joseph's administrative responsibilities within the prison brought him into regular contact with these high-ranking prisoners, and he quickly recognized their potential value as sources of information about court affairs. More importantly, he observed their obvious distress at their uncertain circumstances and their desperate need for someone who could provide both practical assistance and emotional support during their imprisonment. The breakthrough moment came when Joseph noticed that both men appeared particularly troubled one morning, their usual careful composure replaced by visible anxiety and confusion. When he inquired about their distress, they revealed that each had experienced vivid, disturbing dreams during the night, dreams that carried the weight of divine communication, but whose meanings remained obscure and frightening. "We each have had a dream," they told Joseph, "and there is no interpreter of it." This statement reflected the crucial importance of dream interpretation in ancient Egyptian culture, where prophetic visions were considered direct communications from the gods that required skilled analysis to unlock their significance. The royal court employed professional dream interpreters whose expertise was essential for making important governmental decisions, but these specialists were obviously unavailable to imprisoned officials awaiting judgment. Joseph's response revealed how profoundly his understanding of his own gifts had matured during his years of suffering and service. Where once he might have claimed personal credit for interpretative abilities, he now demonstrated the humility and spiritual insight that marked his character development. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" he asked. "Tell them to me, please." This response acknowledged the divine source of interpretative wisdom while offering his services as an instrument through which God might reveal the dream's meanings. The butler was the first to share his nocturnal vision, and its details were both vivid and symbolically rich. In his dream, he had seen a grapevine with 3 branches that budded, blossomed, and produced ripe grapes in rapid succession. He had taken the grapes, pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the beverage in the royal hand, just as he had done countless times during his years of faithful service. Joseph's interpretation was immediate and definitive, delivered with the confidence of someone who recognized divine revelation when he encountered it. "The 3 branches are 3 days," he explained. "Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler." The interpretation carried profound implications for the butler's future, promising not just release from prison, but complete restoration to his former position of trust and influence. Yet Joseph was careful to ground his prediction in divine authority rather than personal insight, making clear that the revelation came from God rather than from his own analytical abilities. Having delivered this encouraging prophecy, Joseph made a request that revealed both his continued hope for freedom and his practical understanding of how Egyptian society functioned. "But remember me when it's well with you," he pleaded, "and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon." This appeal was carefully crafted to maximize its potential effectiveness, while avoiding any statements that might be construed as criticism of Egyptian justice. Joseph identified himself as a victim of kidnapping rather than a legitimate slave, suggested that his imprisonment was based on false accusations without directly challenging Potiphar's wife's credibility, and appealed to the butler's sense of justice and gratitude without making demands that might seem presumptuous. The baker, who had listened to Joseph's interpretation of his colleague's dream with obvious hope, now felt encouraged to share his own nocturnal vision. His dream had featured 3 white baskets stacked on his head, with the uppermost basket containing baked goods intended for Pharaoh's table. But before these delicacies could reach their royal destination, birds had descended from the sky and devoured them completely. Joseph's interpretation of this second dream was as immediate and certain as his analysis of the first, but its message was far more ominous. "The 3 baskets are 3 days," he explained. "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." The parallel structure of the interpretation, 3 days leading to Pharaoh's action in both cases, emphasized the divine origin of both dreams while highlighting the dramatically different fates awaiting the 2 prisoners. The psychological impact of these interpretations on the 3 men involved was profound and immediate. The butler found himself caught between hope for his imminent restoration and anxiety about the accuracy of Joseph's prophetic abilities. The baker faced the terrifying prospect of execution within days, his dreams transformed from mysterious visions into death sentences. Joseph experienced the complex emotions that accompany the delivery of divine revelation. Satisfaction at successfully interpreting the dreams combined with sorrow for the baker's fate, and hope that his assistance might finally lead to his own freedom. The 3 days that followed these interpretations stretched endlessly for all involved, each sunrise bringing them closer to the moment when Joseph's prophecies would be proven true or false. The butler alternated between cautious optimism and fearful doubt, while the baker struggled with the overwhelming dread of impending execution. Joseph maintained his regular prison duties, while watching for any signs that royal messengers might be coming to collect the 2 officials. The vindication of Joseph's interpretations came exactly as he had predicted. On the 3rd day, which happened to be Pharaoh's birthday, a traditional occasion for royal pardons and judicial decisions, messengers arrived at the prison with orders regarding both prisoners. The butler was summoned for immediate restoration to his former position, while the baker was taken away for execution by hanging. The fulfillment of these prophecies in precise detail sent shockwaves through the prison population and established Joseph's reputation as a man possessed of genuine divine insight. Fellow prisoners who had previously viewed him as simply incapable administrator now recognized him as someone marked by supernatural gifts that transcended ordinary human abilities. The chief jailer, already impressed by Joseph's practical competence, gained new appreciation for the mysterious qualities that set his deputy apart from other inmates. Yet the moment that should have marked Joseph's liberation instead became the beginning of a new and more bitter phase of his imprisonment. The butler, restored to his position of influence and daily access to Pharaoh, forgot completely about the Hebrew prisoner who had interpreted his dream and facilitated his release. The man who had promised to remember Joseph's kindness and appeal for royal intervention instead allowed the demands of court life to erase all memory of his prison experience. This betrayal was perhaps more devastating to Joseph than either his brother's original treachery or Potiphar's wife's false accusations. Those earlier injustices had been perpetrated by people whose motivations, however twisted, were at least comprehensible. His brothers had acted from jealousy and resentment that had been building for years. Potiphar's wife had struck back from wounded pride and fear of exposure. But the butler's forgetfulness seemed to represent pure indifference, a casual dismissal of Joseph's humanity that was somehow more degrading than active malice. The ancient narrative records with stark simplicity. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. These words captured not just a failure of memory, but a moral failure that condemned an innocent man to continued suffering while the butler enjoyed his restored prosperity. The Hebrew text suggests that this forgetting was not accidental but deliberate, a conscious decision to avoid the complications that might arise from advocating for a Hebrew prisoner's release. 2 additional years passed in this state of suspended hope, bringing Joseph's total imprisonment to nearly a decade and his separation from his father's household to 13 years. During this extended period, he continued to excel in his prison responsibilities while struggling with the spiritual and emotional challenges posed by his prolonged suffering. The dreams that had marked him for greatness seemed increasingly distant, their fulfillment postponed indefinitely by human indifference and divine timing that defied understanding. Yet even in these darkest circumstances, Joseph's character continued to develop in ways that would prove essential to his ultimate destiny. The administrative skills he had honed in Potiphar's household were refined and expanded through his prison experience. His understanding of human nature deepened through daily interaction with men who had experienced the full range of Egyptian society's opportunities and dangers. His faith in divine providence, tested by repeated disappointments and betrayals, emerged stronger and more mature than the naive confidence of his youth. Most importantly, Joseph learned during these prison years to wait on God's timing rather than demanding immediate fulfillment of prophetic promises. The teenager who had once proclaimed his dreams with youthful certainty had been transformed into a man who understood that divine purposes often unfold through processes of preparation and purification that can span decades. The suffering that seemed to contradict his destined greatness was actually forging him into someone capable of bearing the enormous responsibilities that lay ahead. The stage was being set for events that would vindicate not only Joseph's prophetic gifts, but also God's faithfulness to his covenant promises. The butler's forgetfulness, which seemed to represent the final destruction of Joseph's hopes for freedom, was actually part of a divine timetable that would position the Hebrew prisoner for elevation beyond anything his adolescent dreams had envisioned. The dungeon that appeared to be his permanent prison was about to become the launching pad for his rise to the second highest position in the ancient world's greatest empire. In the royal palace above, Pharaoh himself was about to experience dreams that would shake the foundations of Egyptian confidence and create an urgent need for interpretative wisdom that only Joseph possessed. The forgotten prisoner was about to become the most sought-after man in Egypt, his gifts finally recognized at the precise moment when they were most desperately needed. The long night of suffering was nearly over, and the dawn of unprecedented opportunity was about to break. The royal bedchamber of Pharaoh Amenemhat IV fell silent in the pre-dawn hours of 1719 BC, but sleep had fled from Egypt's most powerful man like a frightened bird. For 2 consecutive nights, the sovereign who commanded the mightiest empire on earth had been tormented by dreams so vivid and disturbing that they shattered his rest and filled his waking hours with dread. These were not ordinary nighttime visions, but communications that carried the unmistakable weight of divine revelation, messages from the gods that demanded interpretation and response. The first dream had transported Pharaoh to the banks of the sacred Nile, Egypt's lifeline and the source of all prosperity in the kingdom. In his vision, he stood watching as 7 magnificent cattle emerged from the river's waters. These were not ordinary beasts, but animals of surpassing beauty and obvious health, fat, sleek creatures whose condition spoke of abundant pasture and perfect care. They moved with the contentment of livestock that had never known want, their bodies reflecting the prosperity that had blessed Egypt for generations. But as Pharaoh watched these beautiful animals graze peacefully along the riverbank, 7 other cattle emerged from the same waters. These second beasts presented a horrifying contrast to their predecessors, gaunt, hollow-eyed creatures whose bones showed through stretched skin, whose movements spoke of desperate hunger and approaching death. They were cattle such as Pharaoh had never seen in all his years ruling the fertile Nile Valley, animals so emaciated that their very existence seemed impossible in a land blessed by annual floods and abundant harvests. The climax of the first dream was as shocking as it was impossible. The 7 starving cattle, driven by incomprehensible hunger, devoured the 7 fat cattle completely. Yet this consumption brought no improvement to their condition. They remained as gaunt and desperate as before, showing no sign that they had consumed anything, much less animals of such obvious health and substance. The second dream had transported Pharaoh from the riverbank to the grain fields that represented Egypt's agricultural wealth. 7 ears of corn grew on a single stalk, each one plump and golden with the promise of abundant harvest. These were grains that would fill the royal granaries and provide sustenance for millions of people throughout the kingdom and beyond. The sight should have filled any Egyptian ruler with satisfaction and confidence about his realm's continued prosperity. But again, the vision took a sinister turn. 7 other ears sprouted on the same stalk. Thin, withered stalks blasted by the scorching east wind that occasionally brought devastation to Egyptian agriculture. These were grains that spoke of crop failure, of fields burned by drought, of granaries that would stand empty while people starved. As in the first dream, the healthy grain was consumed by its sickly counterpart, the 7 thin ears devouring the 7 good ears without showing any improvement from their consumption. The impossible nature of this consumption, thin stalks somehow swallowing fat ones, withered grain absorbing healthy grain, only emphasized the supernatural character of what Pharaoh was witnessing. When the sovereign awoke from these disturbing visions, his entire body was drenched in perspiration, despite the cool pre-dawn air that flowed through his palace chambers. The dreams possessed a clarity and intensity that distinguished them from ordinary sleeping experiences, carrying the unmistakable authority of divine communication. In a culture where dreams were considered direct messages from the gods, Pharaoh understood immediately that he had received revelations of supreme importance for his kingdom's future. The Egyptian approach to dream interpretation involved an elaborate system of professional specialists who had spent years studying the symbolic language through which divine messages were supposedly transmitted. These men, trained in temple schools and supported by extensive libraries of interpretative texts, formed an essential part of the royal administration. No major governmental decision was made without consulting their expertise, and their interpretations often determined policy affecting millions of lives. At the first light of dawn, Pharaoh summoned his entire council of dream interpreters to the throne room. The assembly that gathered represented the pinnacle of Egyptian wisdom and learning, men whose knowledge encompassed not only dream analysis, but also astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and the other sophisticated disciplines that made Egyptian civilization the wonder of the ancient world. Their combined expertise had guided previous pharaohs through countless crises and decisions. Yet when Pharaoh recounted his dreams of this assembly of learned men, their response was unprecedented and deeply troubling. Despite their years of training, their extensive libraries, and their proven track record of successful interpretations, none could offer any explanation for the visions that had disturbed their sovereign's rest. The symbolic language of cattle and grain, elements that should have been fundamental to Egyptian interpretative traditions, somehow eluded their understanding when combined in the specific configurations Pharaoh described. The silence that followed Pharaoh's recounting of his dreams was heavy with implications that extended far beyond simple scholarly inadequacy. If Egypt's most learned men could not interpret divine messages sent to their ruler, what did this suggest about the kingdom's relationship with the gods? If traditional wisdom proved insufficient for understanding these particular revelations, where could Pharaoh turn for the guidance he desperately needed? It was in this moment of intellectual and spiritual crisis that memory stirred in the mind of one particular court official. The chief butler, who had enjoyed 2 years of restored prosperity since his release from royal imprisonment, suddenly recalled the Hebrew prisoner who had interpreted his dream with such stunning accuracy. The man he'd forgotten completely despite his promises of gratitude now seemed like a potential solution to the crisis facing his sovereign. The butler's approach to Pharaoh required careful navigation of court protocols and personal embarrassment. Admitting that he had forgotten to mention a potentially valuable resource for 2 full years could be seen as a serious dereliction of duty. Yet the current crisis was severe enough to warrant risking royal displeasure in exchange for offering a possible solution. "I remember my faults this day," the butler began, his words carrying both confession and hope. "When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we had a dream in one night, each of us according to the interpretation of his dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man according to his dream he interpreted. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged the baker." The butler's testimony carried particular weight, because it described not just successful dream interpretation, but prophetic accuracy that had been verified by subsequent events. In a court where the reliability of advisors could determine the fate of kingdoms, this kind of demonstrated competence was invaluable. Moreover, the Hebrews' interpretations had involved predictions about Pharaoh's own actions, suggesting divine insight into royal decision-making processes. Pharaoh's response was immediate and decisive. "Send and call for him," he commanded, authorizing the butler to arrange for the prisoner's immediate summons to the royal presence. The desperation that drove this unprecedented decision, summoning a foreign slave from prison to advise the sovereign of Egypt, reflected both the severity of the crisis and Pharaoh's pragmatic willingness to seek wisdom wherever it might be found. The messenger who carried Pharaoh's summons to the royal prison found the forgotten Hebrew exactly where the butler had left him 2 years earlier, serving as deputy administrator, managing the facility's daily operations with the same competence that had once made him invaluable to Potiphar's household. The man who received this unexpected royal command had long since abandoned hope that the butler would remember his promise of intercession, accepting his imprisonment as a permanent condition that he would endure through divine grace and personal determination. The transformation required for a royal audience was both physical and symbolic. Rachel's son was hurried through ritual preparations that would make him presentable for appearing before Egypt's sovereign. His hair was shaved according to Egyptian custom, removing the long locks that marked him as a Hebrew, and giving him the clean-shaven appearance expected in Pharaoh's court. His prison garments were replaced with clean robes suitable for a royal audience, though modest enough to reflect his status as a summoned prisoner rather than an honoured guest. Most significantly, these preparations represented another moment when clothing marked a major transition in the young man's destiny. The coat of many colours had symbolised his father's favouritism and his brother's resentment. The garment torn away in Potiphar's house had marked his fall from trusted administrator to accused criminal. Now, clean Egyptian robes signified his emergence from prison obscurity into the presence of the ancient world's most powerful ruler. The throne room that the former household administrator entered was a marvel of ancient architecture and artistic achievement that proclaimed Egypt's supremacy among the nations. Massive columns supported a ceiling decorated with gold and precious stones, while elaborate murals depicted the pharaoh's divine authority and Egypt's military victories over neighbouring peoples. The throne itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, inlaid with gold and precious metals that reflected the morning light streaming through carefully positioned windows. Pharaoh himself was an imposing figure whose bearing reflected the absolute authority he wielded over millions of subjects. Dressed in the traditional regalia of Egyptian kingship, the double crown that symbolised his rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt, the golden crook and flail that represented his role as shepherd and judge of his people. He embodied the divine authority that Egyptians believed their rulers possessed as earthly representatives of the gods. The Hebrew prisoner's approach to the throne was carefully orchestrated according to ancient protocols that governed interactions between commoners and royalty. Yet despite the intimidating grandeur of his surroundings and the overwhelming power differential between himself and Pharaoh, the man who had learned wisdom through 13 years of suffering and service displayed a composure that impressed even the court officials who had arranged his summons. Pharaoh's opening words established both the urgency of his need and his willingness to suspend normal social barriers in pursuit of understanding. "I have had a dream," he declared, "and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it." This statement represented an extraordinary admission of vulnerability from a ruler whose authority depended on his supposed divine connection and superior wisdom. The response that came from the former prisoner revealed how profoundly his character had been shaped by his years of testing and refinement. Where a younger, less experienced version of himself might have claimed personal credit for interpretative abilities or seized the opportunity to elevate his own reputation, the man who now stood before Pharaoh demonstrated the humility and spiritual insight that marked true wisdom. "It is not in me," he replied, directing attention away from personal capabilities toward divine authority. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. This response accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It acknowledged Pharaoh's need while attributing any interpretative success to divine rather than human wisdom. It promised that the interpretation would bring beneficial understanding rather than merely disturbing knowledge, and it positioned the Hebrew as an instrument of divine communication rather than a source of personal power. With this foundation established, Pharaoh proceeded to recount his troubling dreams in the same detail he had provided to his unsuccessful council of wise men. The account of 7 fat cattle, consumed by 7 lean cattle, followed by 7 healthy ears of grain devoured by 7 withered ears, was delivered with the precision of someone whose memory had been seared by the vision's intensity and clarity. The interpretation that followed demonstrated both divine insight and practical wisdom that addressed not just the dream's symbolic meaning, but their implications for governmental policy and national survival. "The dream of Pharaoh is one," the interpreter began, establishing the unified message contained in the 2 separate visions. "God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." The explanation that followed was comprehensive and terrifying in its implications. The 7 fat cattle and 7 healthy ears represented 7 years of unprecedented abundance that would bless Egypt with harvests beyond anything the kingdom had previously experienced. The Nile's floods would be perfectly timed and ideally proportioned. The growing seasons would be blessed with optimal weather conditions, and the agricultural productivity would exceed all expectations. But this abundance would be followed by 7 years of famine so severe that it would consume not only the surplus from the prosperous years, but would threaten the very survival of Egypt's population. The lean cattle and withered grain represented crop failures, failed floods, and agricultural devastation that would make the years of plenty seem like distant memories. The interpretation's most crucial element was its timing and divine authority. "The thing is established by God," the Hebrew declared, "and God will shortly bring it to pass." This was not a distant prophecy or a conditional warning, but an imminent reality that would begin unfolding within the immediate future. Pharaoh had perhaps 7 years to prepare for a crisis that would test every aspect of his kingdom's survival. Yet the man who delivered this sobering prophecy did not stop with mere interpretation. Drawing upon the administrative experience he had gained in Potiphar's household and refined through his prison responsibilities, he offered a comprehensive plan for national survival that transformed crisis into opportunity. "Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years." The plan that followed was brilliant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its scope. During the 7 years of abundance, Egypt would implement a systematic taxation and storage program that would set aside 20% of all agricultural production. This grain would be stored in royal granaries located throughout the kingdom, creating a strategic reserve that could sustain the population through the coming years of famine. More than simply preserving Egyptian lives, This program would position Egypt as the only nation in the region with adequate food supplies during the global crisis that the dreams predicted. Countries that had traditionally competed with Egypt for regional dominance would be forced to come as supplicants, trading their wealth and autonomy for the grain necessary to prevent mass starvation. The administrative complexity of such a program was staggering. It would require the creation of new governmental departments, the construction of massive storage facilities, the training of thousands of officials, and the implementation of record-keeping systems that could track grain reserves across an entire kingdom. Success would depend on finding someone with both the vision to oversee such an unprecedented undertaking and the practical skills to manage its countless details. Pharaoh's response to this interpretation and proposal was immediate and decisive, reflecting both his recognition of the plan's wisdom and his assessment of the man who had presented it. "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" he asked his assembled courtiers, though the question was clearly rhetorical. Having witnessed the Hebrews' divine insight and practical wisdom, Pharaoh had already identified the ideal candidate for implementing the survival strategy. The elevation that followed was as dramatic as anything in ancient history. "You shall be over my house," Pharaoh declared to the man who had entered the throne room as a summoned prisoner, "and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." With these words, the forgotten captive was transformed into the second most powerful man in the ancient world's greatest empire. The symbols of this unprecedented promotion were as significant as the authority they represented. Pharaoh removed his signet ring, the seal that authenticated royal decrees and gave its bearer the power to act with royal authority, and placed it on the Hebrew's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen that marked his new status as a member of the royal court, and placed a gold chain around his neck as a symbol of his exalted position. The ceremonial chariot ride that followed announced to all of Egypt that their kingdom now had a new administrator, whose authority was second only to Pharaoh himself. As the procession moved through Memphis, heralds proclaimed the elevation, and crowds bowed in acknowledgement of the former prisoner's new status. The man who had been forgotten in a dungeon just hours earlier now commanded the respect and obedience of millions of subjects. The biblical narrative records that this dramatic transformation occurred when the Hebrew was 30 years old, 13 years after his brothers had sold him into slavery near Dothan. The teenager who had been torn from his father's house had been transformed through suffering, service, and divine preparation into someone capable of bearing responsibilities that would affect the survival of entire civilizations. The stage was now set for the implementation of a plan that would not only save Egypt from devastating famine, but would also create the circumstances through which the Hebrew's prophetic dreams about his family's future would finally be fulfilled. The young man who had once envisioned his brothers bowing before him was now in a position where that vision would become reality, though through circumstances none of them could have imagined during those distant days in Canaan, when jealousy and resentment had seemed more powerful than divine purpose, establishing the kingdom's reputation as the region's most stable and well-governed civilization. During this period of success and recognition, the vizier married Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. This union represented far more than a personal alliance. It was a strategic integration into Egypt's religious and social hierarchy that cemented his position within the kingdom's power structure. The marriage produced 2 sons whose names reflected their father's complex relationship with his past and his gratitude for divine providence. The firstborn was named Manasseh, meaning making to forget, because God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. The name captured the vizier's deliberate choice to focus on his present responsibilities rather than dwelling on the injustices and sorrows that had marked his journey to power. The second son received the name Ephraim, meaning fruitful, because God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. These names together told the story of a man who had found purpose and prosperity in circumstances that began with betrayal and suffering. Yet even as the Hebrew administrator built a new life in Egypt, establishing himself as one of the ancient world's most successful governmental leaders, the covenant promises that had shaped his youth remained unfulfilled. The dreams of sheaves and celestial bodies bowing before him seemed increasingly distant as years passed without any contact from his family in Canaan. His brothers, who had sold him into slavery to prevent his prophetic visions from coming true, appeared to have succeeded in permanently severing him from his destiny as their leader. The transition from abundance to famine came exactly as predicted, beginning in 1711 BC with failed harvests that spread across the entire ancient Near East. The Nile's floods, which had been perfectly timed for 7 consecutive years, now failed to materialize according to normal patterns. The growing seasons that had blessed Egypt with ideal conditions now brought drought, locusts, and crop diseases that destroyed agricultural production throughout the region. What made this famine particularly devastating was its geographic scope. Previous famines had typically affected limited regions, allowing populations to migrate to unaffected areas or receive assistance from neighbouring kingdoms. But the crisis that began in 1711 BC extended from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from the Mediterranean coast to the Arabian Peninsula, creating a humanitarian disaster that threatened the survival of entire civilizations. Egypt's preparation proved its value immediately. While other kingdoms watched their populations begin to starve, Egypt's granaries released carefully measured quantities of stored grain that sustained both the local population and growing numbers of refugees who fled to the Nile Valley seeking food. The vizier's administrative systems, tested during the years of abundance, now demonstrated their effectiveness under crisis conditions. The distribution program was both generous and carefully controlled. Egyptian citizens received priority access to stored grain at subsidized prices that ensured their survival without completely depleting reserves. Foreign refugees and traders were accommodated through a complex system of payments that included silver, livestock, land, and even personal service when other resources were exhausted. The kingdom that had prepared for famine now found itself in the position of determining who would live and who would die across much of the ancient world. Reports of Egypt's food availability spread rapidly throughout the famine-stricken regions, carried by traders, refugees, and diplomatic missions seeking assistance for their suffering populations. Among the many kingdoms forced to send delegations to Egypt was the land of Canaan, where the drought had proven particularly severe and the lack of advanced storage facilities had left the population facing starvation. In the tents of Jacob near Hebron, the old patriarch faced a crisis that threatened to complete the destruction of his family that had begun 22 years earlier with the loss of his beloved son. The flocks that had provided the household's wealth were dying for lack of pasture. The wells that had sustained his people for generations were running dry, and the grain supplies that might have carried them through a normal drought were exhausted after multiple seasons of failed harvests. The irony of Jacob's situation was profound and tragic. The man who had been blessed with divine promises about his descendants, becoming a great nation, now watched those descendants face extinction through starvation. The covenant that had sustained him through decades of struggle seemed powerless against the practical reality of empty granaries and dying livestock. It was in this desperate context that reports reached Jacob about grain availability in Egypt. Traders who had made the journey south returned with stories of abundant supplies, efficient distribution systems, and a government willing to trade food for payment in silver or other valuable goods. For a family facing starvation, Egypt represented the only viable hope for survival. Jacob's decision to send his sons to Egypt required him to overcome deep personal reluctance and painful memories. The journey would separate him from his remaining children during a time when family unity seemed essential for survival. More troubling, it would require him to trust the same sons who had deceived him about their brother's fate, with a mission that could determine the family's future. The conversation in which Jacob instructed his sons to travel to Egypt was heavy with unspoken grief and barely controlled desperation. "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of a father who had already lost too much. "Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." The Hebrew phrase he used, "that we may live and not die," captured the stark reality facing his household. Yet even in this moment of desperate need, Jacob's lingering pain over his lost son influenced his decision-making. But Jacob did not send Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. The old patriarch's refusal to risk Rachel's remaining son revealed both his continued grief over the presumed death of that son's older brother, and his lack of trust in the remaining son's ability to protect their younger sibling. The group that departed for Egypt consisted of 10 men whose shared secret had bound them together in guilt and deception for more than 2 decades. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher each carried within himself the knowledge of what they had done to their brother and the ongoing deception they maintained about his fate. The journey to Egypt, undertaken out of necessity rather than choice, would confront them with consequences they had never imagined when they sold that brother to Ishmaelite traders near Dothan. The 300-mile journey from Canaan to Egypt took the brothers through territories devastated by the same famine that had driven them from their homeland. Empty villages, abandoned fields, and streams of refugees moving toward the Nile Valley provided constant reminders of the crisis that threatened to destroy entire civilizations. The contrast between this desolation and the reports of Egyptian abundance only emphasized their complete dependence on a foreign power for their family's survival. When Jacob's sons finally reached the administrative centers where Egypt distributed grain to foreign buyers, they encountered a bureaucratic system of stunning sophistication and efficiency. Officials processed hundreds of requests daily, evaluated payment methods, arranged for transportation of purchased grain, and maintained detailed records of all transactions. The brothers, accustomed to the relatively simple trading practices of pastoral life, found themselves navigating a complex governmental apparatus that reflected Egypt's advanced civilization. The brothers' request for an audience with high-level officials to negotiate a substantial grain purchase eventually brought them before the vizier himself, though they had no idea that the powerful Egyptian administrator reviewing their case was the brother they had betrayed decades earlier. The man who sat before them bore little resemblance to the 17-year-old they had cast into a pit near Dothan. His head was shaved in Egyptian fashion, his body clothed in the fine linen of high office, his bearing marked by the authority and confidence that came with years of wielding enormous power. More significantly, the brothers' own appearance and demeanour had changed dramatically during the intervening years. The young men who had once schemed against their father's favourite were now middle-aged heads of households, their faces weathered by decades of outdoor labour, their postures reflecting the weariness that comes from years of responsibility and struggle. The family dynamics that had once defined their relationship seemed distant and irrelevant in the face of their current desperate circumstances. The vizier's recognition of his brothers was immediate and overwhelming, though he maintained perfect composure while processing the emotional impact of this unexpected reunion. 22 years of wondering about his family's welfare, of grief over separation from his father, of questions about whether his brothers had ever felt remorse for their actions. All of these emotions crashed over him simultaneously as he looked upon the men who had shaped his destiny through their cruelty. Yet his brothers showed no signs of recognition, addressing him with the deference appropriate to his exalted position, while remaining completely unaware of his true identity. They bowed before him exactly as his adolescent dreams had predicted, fulfilling prophecies they had tried to prevent through their act of betrayal. The irony was profound. The very men who had rejected his claims of future authority now prostrated themselves before him, seeking favours that only he could grant. The response that came from Egypt's second-in-command was carefully calculated to test both his brothers' current character and their honesty about family circumstances. Speaking through interpreters to maintain his disguise, he accused them of being spies sent to observe Egypt's defensive weaknesses. "You are spies," he declared. "You have come to see the nakedness of the land." This accusation placed the brothers in immediate danger, while creating an opportunity for the vizier to evaluate how they would respond under pressure. Their defense revealed important information about family circumstances and demonstrated whether the character flaws that had led to their betrayal of him decades earlier had been corrected through time and experience. "No, my lord," they replied, "but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Their response included crucial intelligence about their father's continued survival and their own self-perception as honest men, a characterization that would have been ironically amusing if the circumstances had been less serious. The interrogation that followed was designed to extract information about Benjamin while testing the brothers' truthfulness about family matters. "You are spies," the vizier repeated. "In this manner you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." The mention of their youngest brother created visible distress among the 10 men, confirming the vizier's suspicions about family dynamics, while revealing their protective attitude toward Benjamin. Their obvious reluctance to bring their youngest brother to Egypt suggested that some lessons had been learned from past tragedies, even if they remained unaware of their connection to those events. The 3-day imprisonment that followed gave the brothers time to discuss their situation and reflect on possible reasons for their unexpected troubles. The conversations that took place during those days of confinement revealed how the guilt they had carried for decades continued to influence their interpretation of current events. "We are truly guilty concerning our brother," they said to one another, unaware that their words were being understood by the Egyptian official who held their fate in his hands. "We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us." The admission confirmed that their memories of betraying their brother remained vivid and painful, and that they interpreted their current crisis as divine judgment for past sins. Reuben's response revealed his continued sense of responsibility as the eldest son, and his ongoing guilt over failing to prevent the tragedy that had befallen their family. "Did I not speak to you, saying, 'Do not sin against the boy,' and you would not listen? Therefore behold, his blood is now required of us." The eldest brother's words indicated that he still believed their sibling was dead, and that their current troubles represented divine retribution for his murder. The emotional impact of hearing his brothers express genuine remorse for their treatment of him was almost overwhelming for the vizier, who had to excuse himself from their presence to weep privately before returning to continue the charade. Their obvious grief and guilt suggested that the intervening years had brought some measure of maturity and moral development, though whether this growth was sufficient to be trusted with Benjamin's safety remained to be determined. The modified terms that the Egyptian administrator offered represented a compromise between his desire to see Benjamin and his recognition that keeping all 10 brothers imprisoned would prevent them from returning with grain to sustain their father. "Do this and live," he told them, "for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house. But you, go and carry grain for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die." The selection of Simeon as the brother who would remain in Egyptian custody was strategically chosen. As the second oldest son and one of the most aggressive in temperament, Simeon's imprisonment would create maximum pressure on the family to comply with the vizier's demands, while removing one of the most potentially troublesome personalities from the group returning to Canaan. The grain distribution that followed was generous beyond normal commercial practices, suggesting governmental favour that the brothers could not have earned through their own merits. Each man's sack was filled with premium grain, and their payment silver was secretly returned to them, a detail they would not discover until after leaving Egypt. This unexpected generosity created both gratitude and anxiety, as they could not understand why they had received such favourable treatment from Egyptian authorities. The journey back to Canaan was marked by growing anxiety as the brothers contemplated how they would explain Simeon's absence to their father and persuade him to allow Benjamin to travel to Egypt. The discovery of their returned silver at an overnight stopping point only increased their distress, as they interpreted this development as evidence of divine displeasure rather than Egyptian favour. "What is this that God has done to us?" they asked each other, their guilt-shaped worldview leading them to assume that unexpected events must represent divine punishment rather than blessing. The fear that they might be accused of theft when they returned to Egypt added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The reunion with Jacob near Hebron was as difficult as the brothers had anticipated. The old patriarch's joy at seeing 9 of his sons return safely was immediately replaced by grief and anger when he learned that Simeon had been left behind as surety for Benjamin's appearance before Egyptian authorities. "You have bereaved me of my children," Jacob cried, his voice breaking with the accumulated grief of decades. "Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me." The patriarch's anguish revealed how completely the loss of his favoured son continued to dominate his emotional landscape, making the prospect of losing Rachel's remaining child unbearable. Reuben's desperate offer to leave his own 2 sons as hostages if Benjamin did not return safely failed to persuade Jacob, whose trust in his eldest son's judgment had been shattered by past tragedies. "My son shall not go down with you," the old man declared with finality, "for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you would bring down my grey hair with sorrow to the grave." As the grain purchased in Egypt was gradually consumed and the famine continued its relentless grip on the land, the family faced an impossible choice between allowing Benjamin to travel to Egypt or watching their household starve. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every aspect of family loyalty, moral growth, and divine providence, as the brothers prepared to return to a country where their past sins had created consequences they were only beginning to understand. The grain purchased during the brothers' first journey to Egypt sustained Jacob's household through several months of continued famine. But by 1710 BC, their supplies were nearly exhausted, and the crisis in Canaan showed no signs of abating. The rains that should have replenished the wells remained absent, the pastures that should have supported their flocks lay barren, and the prospect of another growing season without adequate seed grain threatened to make their situation hopeless. Jacob's resistance to sending Benjamin to Egypt had held firm for months, despite the increasingly desperate circumstances facing his household. The old patriarch, now approaching his 130th year, clung to Rachel's remaining son with the fierce protectiveness of a man who had already lost too much. Yet the practical realities of starvation were gradually overwhelming his emotional objections, creating an unbearable tension between his need to preserve Benjamin's safety and his responsibility to ensure his family's survival. The conversation that finally broke Jacob's resolve was initiated by Judah, whose natural authority among his brothers had grown stronger with age and experience. Unlike Reuben's impulsive offers of his own sons as hostages, Judah's approach demonstrated the kind of measured reasoning that had made him increasingly influential in family decisions. "The famine is severe over us," Judah began, his words carrying the weight of undeniable reality. "If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, for the man said to us, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.'" The fourth son's presentation of their options was stark and uncompromising. Either Benjamin travelled to Egypt, or the entire family would starve. Jacob's response revealed the depths of his continuing anguish over past losses and his inability to understand how his family had reached such desperate circumstances. "Why did you deal so wrongfully with me as to tell the man whether you had yet a brother?" The patriarch's question suggested that he blamed his sons for creating the current crisis through their honesty about Benjamin's existence, unaware that their trouble stemmed from much deeper sources. The brothers' explanation of their encounter with Egypt's vizier demonstrated how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered by someone whose identity remained hidden from them. "The man asked us pointedly about ourselves and our family," they replied, recounting an interrogation that had seemed like routine administrative questioning at the time. "Is your father still alive? Have you another brother?" And we told him according to these words. Could we possibly have known that he would say, "Bring your brother down"? Judah's final appeal combined personal accountability with practical urgency in a way that finally broke through Jacob's resistance. "Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones. I myself will be surety for him. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. For if we had not lingered, surely by now we could have returned this second time." The transformation in Judah's character was remarkable when compared to the man who had once suggested selling his brother to slave traders for 20 pieces of silver. The years had taught him something about responsibility, sacrifice, and the true meaning of brotherhood. His willingness to stake his own future on Benjamin's safe return represented the kind of moral growth that suffering and experience can sometimes produce in human hearts. Jacob's reluctant agreement to let Benjamin travel to Egypt came with careful preparations designed to maximize their chances of success and minimize potential dangers. "If it must be so, now do this," he instructed his sons with the weariness of a man surrendering to circumstances beyond his control. "Take some of the best fruits of the land in your vessels and carry down a present for the man. A little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds." The gifts Jacob selected represented the finest products that Canaan could offer, despite the famine's devastating impact on agricultural production. These luxury items, aromatic resins, rare spices, and choice nuts, were the kind of presents that demonstrated respect for Egyptian authority, while showcasing the quality of goods that peaceful trade relationships might produce in better times. More significantly, Jacob instructed his sons to take double the amount of silver necessary for purchasing grain, including the money that had mysteriously been returned in their sacks during the previous journey. "Take double money in your hand," he told them, "and take back in your hand the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks." Perhaps it was an oversight. The old patriarch's assumption that the returned silver represented an administrative error revealed his inability to imagine the true reasons for Egyptian generosity toward his family. The blessing Jacob pronounced over his sons as they prepared to depart carried both his desperate hope and his resigned acceptance of divine will. "And may God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may release your other brother and Benjamin. If I am bereaved, I am bereaved." These words echoed the faith that had sustained him through decades of struggle, even as they acknowledged his powerlessness to control the outcome of this crucial mission. The journey to Egypt during Benjamin's first trip was markedly different from his brother's previous experience. The young man's presence seemed to energize the group, reminding them of their responsibility to protect Jacob's remaining joy, while creating opportunities for conversations that had been impossible during their guilt-ridden first journey. Benjamin himself, now in his early 20s, displayed the intelligence and character that had made him precious to his father, while showing none of the arrogance that had once characterized his older brother's behavior. When the 11 brothers presented themselves at the Egyptian Administrative Center, where grain was distributed to foreign buyers, the response they received was immediate and unprecedented. Rather than being processed through normal bureaucratic channels, they were directed to the vizier's personal residence with instructions to prepare for a midday meal. This unexpected honour created both gratitude and anxiety among men who had learned to interpret unusual events as potential threats. The steward who managed the vizier's household arrangements displayed a warmth and consideration that seemed inconsistent with normal Egyptian treatment of foreign grain buyers. When the brothers expressed concern about the silver that had been returned in their sacks, his response was both reassuring and mysterious. "Peace be with you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money." This statement suggested divine favour rather than administrative oversight, though the brothers remained too focused on immediate concerns to fully comprehend its implications. The reunion with Simeon provided the first hint that their reception in Egypt involved more than routine diplomatic courtesy. The second son, who should have been weakened by months of imprisonment, appeared well fed and in good health, suggesting that his captivity had been more comfortable than they had feared. His obvious relief at seeing his brothers, combined with his reluctance to discuss his treatment in detail, added to the growing sense that their situation was more complex than it appeared. The preparations for dining in the vizier's house required the brothers to navigate cultural protocols that were entirely foreign to their pastoral background. Egyptian dining customs involved elaborate arrangements based on social hierarchy, ritual purification requirements that reflected religious beliefs, and sophisticated etiquette that demonstrated the host's refinement and the guest's proper respect. For men accustomed to the informal meal practices of nomadic life, this formal entertainment was both intimidating and educational. When the vizier himself arrived for the meal, the brothers' presentation of their gifts and their formal expressions of respect followed the careful instructions Jacob had provided. "We have brought down a present for our lord," they declared, bowing before the powerful Egyptian official whose identity remained hidden from them. Their inquiry about their father's welfare, "Your servant, our father, is in good health. He is still alive," was delivered with the kind of deference appropriate to their desperate circumstances. The response their question received revealed emotions that Egyptian officials were not supposed to display. "Is this your younger brother of whom you spoke to me?" the vizier asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the overwhelming impact of seeing Benjamin for the first time in over 2 decades. The blessing he pronounced over Rachel's younger son, "God be gracious to you, my son," carried an intensity that seemed disproportionate to normal diplomatic courtesy. The vizier's sudden departure from the dining hall, ostensibly to attend to urgent business, allowed him to weep privately while processing the emotional impact of seeing both Benjamin and his other brothers healthy and together. The man who commanded the second most powerful position in the ancient world found himself overwhelmed by feelings that had been buried for 22 years, but remained as powerful as ever. The meal that followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation designed to test his brother's attitudes toward Benjamin, while demonstrating knowledge that no Egyptian official should have possessed. The seating arrangement placed the brothers in perfect order according to their ages, from Reuben the eldest to Benjamin the youngest, a detail that should have been impossible for any foreigner to know. Their obvious amazement at this precise knowledge was noted carefully by their host, who continued to maintain his disguise while gathering intelligence about their character development. The special treatment accorded to Benjamin during the meal was both generous and deliberately provocative. So they took portions to them from before him, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. This favoritism was designed to recreate the family dynamics that had once led to violence, testing whether the brothers had learned to control their jealousy, or whether they would respond to Benjamin's privileged treatment with the same resentment they had once shown toward another favoured brother. The brothers' reaction to Benjamin's special treatment was carefully observed by their host, who was relieved to see no signs of the jealousy and resentment that had once poisoned their family relationships. Instead, they seemed genuinely pleased by their youngest brother's honour, demonstrating a maturity and generosity that suggested real character growth during the intervening years. The final test that would determine whether the brothers had truly changed came through an elaborate deception involving a silver cup and accusations of theft. As the brothers prepared to depart Egypt with their grain purchases, the vizier's steward was secretly instructed to place his master's personal drinking cup in Benjamin's grain sack, creating evidence that would justify serious charges against Jacob's youngest son. The pursuit that overtook the brothers shortly after their departure from the city was both dramatic and terrifying. "Why have you repaid evil for good?" the steward demanded when he caught up with their caravan. "Is not this the one from which my lord drinks, and with which he indeed practices divination? You have done evil in so doing." The accusation of stealing the vizier's personal cup was serious enough to warrant severe punishment, while the mention of divination added religious implications that made the offence even more grave. The brothers' confident denial of the theft charges reflected their genuine innocence and their trust in one another's honesty. "With whomever of your servants it is found, let him die, and we also will be my lord's slaves," they declared, unaware that their challenge would soon expose them to exactly the kind of crisis they had hoped to avoid. The discovery of the cup in Benjamin's sack was as shocking to them as it was devastating to their hopes of returning safely to their father. The return to the vizier's house under charges of theft represented the complete collapse of everything the brothers had hoped to accomplish. Not only had they failed to secure grain for their starving family, but they now faced the prospect of losing Benjamin to Egyptian justice, while explaining to Jacob how his remaining son from Rachel had been lost to circumstances beyond their control. The brothers' response to this crisis revealed how profoundly their characters had been shaped by decades of guilt and suffering. Rather than abandoning Benjamin to save themselves, they chose to remain together and face whatever judgment awaited them. "What shall we say to my lord?" Judah asked when they stood before the vizier once again. "What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my lord's slaves, both we and he also with whom the cup was found." The vizier's response to their collective offer of slavery was designed to create maximum pressure on their family loyalty, while testing their willingness to sacrifice for Benjamin's welfare. "Far be it from me that I should do so," he declared. "The man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave. And as for you, go up in peace to your father." This judgment placed the brothers in an impossible position. They could save themselves by abandoning Benjamin, or they could remain loyal to their youngest brother and face their father's devastating grief over the loss of his last link to Rachel. Judah's response to this ultimate test demonstrated the complete transformation his character had undergone since the day he had suggested selling their brother to Ishmaelite traders. His plea to the vizier was one of the most eloquent and moving speeches recorded in ancient literature, revealing a man who had learned the true meaning of responsibility, sacrifice, and love. "O my lord," Judah began, "please let your servant speak a word in my lord's ears, and do not let your anger burn against your servant, for you are even like Pharaoh." The respect and humility in his approach contrasted sharply with the calculating selfishness that had once characterized his decision-making, showing how suffering and experience had taught him wisdom. The account Judah provided of their family circumstances was detailed and heartbreaking, revealing the intimate knowledge of his father's emotional state that came from years of watching Jacob grieve for his lost son. My lord asked his servants, saying, "Have you a father or a brother?" And we said to my lord, "We have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, who is young. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother, and his father loves him." The description of Jacob's attachment to Benjamin and his refusal to let the young man travel to Egypt initially provided context that explained why losing Benjamin would destroy the old patriarch completely. "Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will happen, when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. So your servants will bring down the grey hair of your servant our father with sorrow to the grave." Judah's final offer represented the ultimate expression of brotherly love and personal responsibility. "Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father?" This willingness to sacrifice his own freedom to preserve Benjamin's liberty and Jacob's happiness demonstrated moral growth that was nothing short of remarkable. The emotional impact of hearing Judah's plea was more than the vizier could bear while maintaining his disguise. The evidence of his brother's genuine repentance, their obvious love for Benjamin, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for their father's welfare proved that the character flaws which had led to his own betrayal had been corrected through years of suffering and spiritual growth. "Make every man go out from me," the vizier commanded his Egyptian attendants, ensuring that the revelation of his identity would take place in private. So no one stood with him while he made himself known to his brothers. The moment that followed was one of the most dramatic personal revelations in all of human history, as the most powerful man in Egypt prepared to disclose his true identity to the siblings who had sold him into slavery decades earlier. The words that shattered 2 decades of separation and deception were simple and direct. "I am your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." The brothers' reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Shock, terror, disbelief, and crushing guilt combined to render them speechless, as they processed the impossible reality that the Egyptian vizier they had been dealing with was the brother they had betrayed in their youth. The man who revealed himself to them bore little resemblance to the 17-year-old they had cast into a pit near Dothan. His Egyptian attire, his shaved head, his bearing of absolute authority, and his obvious wealth and power made it difficult to reconcile this figure with their memories of their father's favoured son. Yet the eyes that looked upon them with a mixture of joy and sorrow were unmistakably those of the brother whose dreams of future greatness they had tried to destroy through their act of betrayal. The immediate response from the powerful vizier was not condemnation or demands for retribution, but words of comfort and reassurance that demonstrated how completely his character had been refined through suffering. "Please come near to me," he urged his terror-stricken brothers. "I am your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." The theological interpretation he offered of their shared history transformed their act of betrayal into an instrument of divine providence that had saved not only their own family, but entire nations from starvation. "And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." This remarkable demonstration of forgiveness was grounded not in denial of their guilt or minimization of their cruelty, but in a mature understanding of how divine sovereignty could work through human evil to accomplish purposes that transcended immediate circumstances. The man who had every right to demand justice chose instead to offer grace, transforming what should have been a moment of reckoning into an occasion for family restoration. The practical instructions that followed this emotional revelation demonstrated both urgency and careful planning for the family's survival and prosperity. "Go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine.'" The reunion that followed years of separation was marked by tears, embraces, and conversations that attempted to bridge the gap created by decades of divergent experiences. Benjamin, meeting his full brother for the first time since childhood, was embraced with particular emotion as the vizier grieved for all the years of relationship that had been lost through their separation. Each of the other brothers received forgiveness and restoration that they had never dared hope for. Their guilt transformed into gratitude through an act of grace that defied human understanding. The news of this family reunion spread quickly through Pharaoh's court, where the vizier's personal history had remained largely unknown despite his years of faithful service. The king's response to learning about his administrator's Hebrew origins and family circumstances was both generous and politically astute. "Say to your brothers, 'Do this, load your animals and depart. Go to the land of Canaan. Bring your father and your households and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land.'" The provision that Pharaoh authorized for the family's relocation was lavish beyond anything they could have imagined when they first left Canaan seeking grain. Wagons were provided for transporting the elderly and infirm. Clothing and gifts were distributed to each brother, and special provisions were made for Jacob's comfort during the journey. The family that had been facing starvation was now being invited to enjoy the prosperity of the ancient world's greatest civilization. The return to Canaan with news of their discoveries created the most joyful upheaval in Jacob's household since the days when his children were young and his future seemed bright with promise. The old patriarch's initial reaction to reports of his son's survival and elevation was disbelief. The loss had been too complete, the grief too profound, for him to immediately accept that the tragedy that had defined his later years had been based on deception. "My son is still alive," Jacob exclaimed when the reality finally penetrated his amazement. "I will go and see him before I die." The prospect of reunion with the son he'd mourned for over 2 decades energized the ancient patriarch in ways that seemed to reverse years of grief and decline. The covenant promises that had sustained him through decades of struggle suddenly seemed not only possible but imminent, as he prepared for the journey that would reunite his family and position them for the fulfillment of divine destiny. The migration that followed brought 70 members of Jacob's household to Egypt, where they were settled in the fertile land of Goshen under the protection and provision of the world's most powerful government. The reunion between father and son was emotional beyond description, healing wounds that had festered for more than 2 decades, while demonstrating the faithfulness of God to covenant promises that had seemed impossible of fulfillment. The audience with Pharaoh that followed Jacob's arrival in Egypt was remarkable for its demonstration of spiritual authority that transcended political power. When the Hebrew patriarch was presented to Egypt's sovereign, his response was to bless the king, an act that recognized divine authority as superior to human government and established the spiritual principles that would guide his family's future in their new homeland. The years that followed Jacob's settlement in Egypt were marked by continued prosperity and family reconciliation that gradually healed the wounds created by decades of deception and separation. The vizier's position ensured his family's welfare, while his wisdom and administrative skills continued to benefit Egypt throughout the remaining years of famine. The dreams that had once seemed like sources of division became symbols of divine faithfulness and family unity. As Jacob's life drew to its close, the blessing he pronounced over his sons reflected both his gratitude for their restoration and his prophetic insight into their future destinies. The son who had once been lost was now positioned to lead his family through challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, while his brothers had been transformed from jealous rivals into supportive allies who understood the value of family unity. The final words that Jacob spoke to the son who had been restored to him captured the theological significance of their shared journey through suffering to redemption. "God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." The legacy that emerged from this remarkable story of betrayal, suffering, and ultimate redemption became a foundation for understanding how divine providence works through human circumstances to accomplish purposes that transcend immediate understanding. The young man who had been marked by prophetic dreams learned through years of testing that God's promises are always fulfilled, though often through pathways that challenge every assumption about how divine purposes should unfold. The Egypt that welcomed Jacob's family as honored guests would eventually become the place of their enslavement, testing their faithfulness to covenant promises through centuries of oppression before their dramatic liberation under Moses. Yet even that future suffering would be part of the larger divine plan that had begun with dreams of greatness in a young man's heart and had been worked out through betrayal, slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and ultimate elevation to unprecedented power and influence. The man who spoke his final declaration of divine sovereignty over human affairs had learned through experience that God's purposes are always accomplished, regardless of the opposition they encounter or the time required for their fulfillment. As for you, you meant evil against me, he told his brothers in words that have echoed through centuries of human history. But God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. This statement became the theological key that unlocked the meaning of suffering, injustice, and apparent defeat in human experience. The story that began with a coat of many colours and dreams of future greatness had demonstrated through decades of testing that divine purposes are ultimately irresistible, transforming even the cruelest human actions into instruments of salvation and redemption that benefit not just individuals but entire civilizations. The young dreamer who had been cast into a pit by jealous brothers had become a deliverer whose wisdom saved nations from starvation. The family that had been torn apart by jealousy and deception had been restored to unity and prosperity beyond their wildest imagination. The covenant promises that had seemed impossible of fulfillment had been vindicated through circumstances that defied human planning or understanding. Most significantly, the story that had unfolded in Egypt became a prophetic preview of an even greater drama of betrayal, suffering, and ultimate redemption that would one day be played out on the stage of human history. The son who had been rejected by his brothers but elevated by divine purpose to save his people from destruction would find his ultimate fulfillment in another son, also betrayed for silver, also condemned unjustly, also elevated to the right hand of power, and also committed to the salvation of the very people who had rejected him. The coat of many colours had been stained with blood and abandoned in the wilderness, but the dreams it had symbolised had been fulfilled beyond anything their original recipient could have imagined. The story that ended with forgiveness, restoration, and divine vindication became a permanent testimony to the truth that God's purposes are always accomplished, that his love is stronger than human hatred, and that his plans for redemption can transform even the darkest moments of human experience into occasions for hope, healing, and ultimate triumph.